This is Retrospective Facilitation, a podcast for facilitators that want to make their retrospectives even more effective. Welcome back. This is the third episode of a series of special interviews I did with military veterans, and we talked about debriefings and connections with retrospectives. Today we interview Dan Greene. Dan was an F18 fighter pilot for the Navy for about 10 years. He was deployed on an aircraft carrier and he went to some war zones. So he will tell us a little bit about his experience in military debriefings as well as comparison with his current career. He's been working for over 10 years in the tech industries for companies like Google and Twitter, where he was an executive. So it's going to be an interesting connection that we draw, how we run debriefings or how he's seen debriefings run in companies in the tech industry, and how they were run in the military in high stakes environments like piloting a fighter jet. Cool. So Dan, thank you so much for joining the show. Do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name's Dan Greene. I'm a revenue leader in the tech industry now and have been in the tech industry for about 15 years or so. The first part of my career, first 10 years of my career, I was a Navy pilot in the U.S.
Nice. And we have a common contact, John. I work with John, and you both served. And I was asking John for other people that have been veterans and talk about debriefings in during military actions, during deployments. And can you tell us a little bit about the time that you were flying those fighter jets? And you were on an aircraft carrier, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I flew an airplane called an F18 Hornet. It was a carrier-based airplane, so you'd be assigned to a squadron at your home base, and then you would deploy on aircraft carriers periodically. So I spent a lot of time flying from both land and sea.
Nice. And do you have a particular story or episode when a debriefing was run after one of those missions? And what can you tell us about the formats of the debriefings in the Navy?
Well, I probably have thousands of episodes because debriefing in the Navy, and I think this is especially true in aviation, but it's true broadly across the military. So the concept of debriefing something is as commonplace as like tying your shoe, right? Like essentially what happens in the military. And I'll speak just generally, like every unit, whether it's an infantry unit or ships or submarines or airplanes, every unit basically does two things. They train at home typically, or they could be deployed and there could be training as well. But they train and they train in what they do, right? The ship goes out and it trains, or the airplanes fly and they train. So training is the first piece, and then the second piece is what we'd call sort of real world operations. So you could be deployed into a theater of operations and you're conducting sort of live operations. Sometimes they could be in combat, but sometimes it can just be patrolling, or it could be just operating at sea, or operating in some forward deployed location. And so every unit's doing both training and operating, and every single time any given unit is either does a training exercise, even something as simple as an hour-long training episode, or a multi-day exercise, or a real live real world kind of operation. They will always debrief that. So debriefing is something that's done constantly.
Nice. And
very, very
who
common.
calls those debriefings? Is it like the superior officer? Would the team just like do it themselves?
Yeah, the teams, it's just automatic. So I'll give you more specific examples of how it would operate, how this would sort of manifest itself in the aviation world. So we would fly every day, once or twice a day. And This could be both at home at our home base or on a carrier, and it could be in the Persian Gulf, or it could be off the coast of California, or it could be at our home base. And so you'd fly once or twice a day as an individual, and every single flight involved the following. It involved some preparation, so some planning and preparation. It could be, for a very complex flight or very complex training or very complex operation, it could be days of planning, um, or it could be just a couple hours. And then you would conduct a brief you'd prepare and then conduct a brief. So everybody involved in that flight would brief for an hour or 2 hours prior to the flight,
And
covering
that's kind of the plan.
everything from like what you're going to do to how you're going to do it, what the objectives are, who's going to be doing what, and safe. You'd also cover like safety precautions and things like that. And so simple flights, the brief could be half an hour. Complex flights, the brief could be 2 hours or even more. Um, and then you would go and do the flight, and the flights could be anywhere from an hour to 5 hours. And then you would come back, get all your flight gear off, and you reassemble in a. And by the way, we had designated briefing and debriefing rooms. So in your
Was there post-it notes?
what's that?
Was there any post-it notes?
Post-it notes. Yeah, there would be. So just like we have meeting rooms in the tech industry or any business, we had rooms that were set aside for briefing and debriefing. They all had whiteboards in them. They also had. They typically had. This is a few years ago, so they had video screens with essentially VCR players, because you could record a lot of things that happened in the cockpit, and so video playback was a key part of the debrief.
So looking at data.
Yeah,
Nice.
you're looking at data. You're listening to the communications. You're watching what happened during the flight, and the video recording devices would record the radar screens and everything you were doing there, as well as your heads-up display and the audio. So you could come back and you could sync up all the tapes from everybody who's there, and you can play everything. And you also had, if you were operating in certain training areas, they had the ability to data link to your airplane, and so you could record, like, imagine almost like a video game, and you could see all the airplanes and what they were doing, and zoom in and zoom out. It was pretty intricate. It's pretty interesting.
Nice.
And anyway, so you would go to the flight, you'd come back, you'd get your tapes and all your notes, because you're taking notes throughout the flight as well. And you would sit down in a group, everybody who's there. So, like, it might have been 2 pilots, might have been 20 pilots. You might have senior ranking officers and more junior officers. Everybody who was there gets together, and there's always a designated flight lead. So somebody was in charge of that flight, and that person not only runs the brief, but also runs the debrief.
And is that person flying with a group,
Yeah.
or maybe is?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not like somebody separate. It would be, if it was 4 people that went flying, one of them was the flight lead, designated as the flight lead for that flight, and that person would lead the debrief. And the debrief had there's a couple of things that the way the debriefs would go is, first, the concept is that you check your rank at the door. And so it doesn't matter what your rank is. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how senior you are. Everybody is equal in the debrief. This is really important, because the whole point of the debrief is to learn. And if you're worried about who's senior to whom, and if you're worried about people getting angry because you're calling out mistakes or anything like that, you're never going to learn what you need to learn. And the stakes are really very, very high. So it's critical that you learn in the debrief.
Nice. And so, would you say during those debrief, was it like how was the safe environment kind of like set? Was it just like a default? People knew that was the mindset of it, or was
Yeah,
it different? Sometime
you were
in
taught.
different companies you have different safety levels.
Yeah,
How was it in the Navy?
that's a good question. Different squadrons had different culture, and just like different companies do or different teams do in a company. So yeah, there's probably different levels of safetiness, but ultimately, it was pretty consistent. And like, it started when you're in flight school with your instructor pilots, and like this concept of briefing, flying, debriefing. It started early in your culturalization into naval aviation, and it just continued. Um, and even if it was an informal flight, you still briefed, flew, and debriefed. Even if it was a very informal, just like taking a couple jets and flying them across the country to get them somewhere. Like even that simple of a process, you would still cover the basics.
Would you ever miss a debrief?
Could you miss a debrief?
Yeah, would you ever would it ever not happen?
I don't remember it ever not happening. I think
That's great.
there occasionally, for a very simple flight, it might have been like, hey, you got anything it might have been a 5-minute debrief. Um, but if somebody
Nice.
missed the debrief, it was pretty rare, and it was generally frowned upon. And the debriefs, by the way, they could go anywhere from 10 minutes for a simple simple flight exercise, to 2 hours. And the basic process is, you would basically evaluate everything from the preparation and to the brief itself, to the flight, and then debrief the debrief.
Nice.
And you would use whiteboards, and people were taking notes. And there are many times where a training flight was actually an evaluation piece as well. So you might be grading certain people on their progression, and so there was evaluation reports to be filled out, things like that.
Nice. Can you think of a debrief during the time you were deployed that comes to mind that is memorable, that you want to share with the audience?
So one time, let's see, we were flying. I was assigned to a squadron, and that squadron was one of a few squadrons assigned to an aircraft carrier, and we had deployed across the Western Pacific, into Asia, and then eventually into the Persian Gulf. And we operated in the Persian Gulf for a few months, essentially enforcing the UN sanctions and no-fly zones over southern Iraq. So this is before 9/11, after the first Persian Gulf War. And so the basic mission was, we would have you would get a long list of missions assigned for the day, and our air wing would sort of operate throughout the day to fulfill these missions, which were essentially taking our airplanes and flying them over southern Iraq and ensuring that the Iraqi Air Force and Army weren't doing anything they weren't supposed to be doing. And occasionally they would do the things that they weren't supposed to do, like move troops and equipment or fly airplanes, and then we would take action against them. So that was the basic thing that we were doing for several years. And the environment over southern Iraq was such that they had deployed military assets all around the southern part of their country, including surface-to-air missile sites. And surface-to-air missile sites are generally, where they are. And we would have charts that would show them where they are, and we would have those locations set into our navigation system, so we could avoid those surface-to-air missile sites. And so basically, you can imagine a map of California with big bubbles on it, and those big bubbles are different sizes depending on the surface-to-air missile, and you have to avoid those bubbles as you fly around. You're not supposed to fly through surface-to-air missile envelopes. And we got a new executive officer in our squadron about halfway through our deployment, meaning an executive officer is like the second in command of the squadron. The squadron's about 150 people, 200 people, with about 15 pilots, and the most senior pilot is the commanding officer. The second most senior pilot's called the executive officer, and after about 2 years, the executive officer takes over as the commanding officer. So this new executive officer came aboard, and he and I were slated to fly together, and I was a very junior pilot. And so
And that was on two separate planes?
Yeah, two separate planes.
Right?
He flies his plane, I fly the other, so I'm his wingman. And our mission was to go and spend about 4 hours patrolling the no-fly zone and along certain paths. And we prepared, briefed, suited up, launched in our airplanes off the carrier, refueled, went over southern Iraq and started conducting our mission. And at one point in time, um, I noticed that we were sort of heading right for this surface-to-air missile envelope. And I checked in with him on the radio. You're supposed to keep radio communications to a minimum. And I can't remember exactly what I said. This is years ago, but something like, "Hey, heads up, there's a code name for it. Pencil is 20 miles north of us. Roger." And then sure enough, we're getting relatively close to this missile, and I had to come on. I'm like, "Hey, XO, we need to turn south immediately." And we a little back and forth between the two of us, and he realized that the mistake he had made, and so we turned around and continued our mission, and we came back, and the debrief. I was the most junior pilot in the squadron. He was one of the most senior pilots in the squadron, but he fully recognized his mistake. He had the wrong point entered into his system, and had made a mistake, and a real bonehead mistake, and acknowledged that, and acknowledged my heads up. And so that's just an example. Those types of things happened all the time, but that's just an example of how in the debrief you have to check rank at the door, and you have to own up to your mistakes and acknowledge when we make them, and what happened, and why, what we need to do to improve the next time.
Nice, awesome. So in general, like, were there like actions coming out of like the debrief? Were there like I don't know, changes into the procedures, or was there ever like action taken out of like a debrief? And not looking corrective, but more like I was speaking with someone else that was in the army, and they were saying like they changed tactics on the floor based on some of those debriefs.
Well, yes. So that would happen all the time in sort of in different ways. One way it would happen is not as much in training. So if we were back home, or maybe on the carrier, but not in a combat zone or something, like, there weren't necessarily things that you were taking away from a debrief and changing from a systems or from a process point of view broadly. There would be things that you would take away individually and learn and change, and those types of things happen. I mean, literally all the time, where you're learning from the debrief, and you're learning from like, basically the concept is everybody learns by doing, right? Like, we all learn by doing, whether it's coding or selling or flying or whatever. We all learn by doing. But if you spend some dedicated time debriefing and even thinking about what you're doing, like, your development, your pace of development will be, in my experience, much higher, right? Like a much faster pace of development. And so this concept of debriefing, this learning concept, happened all the time, and so you were constantly learning through that process. In combat zones and sort of real world operations, we took that the debrief information was also captured by the intelligence team, and the intelligence team was aggregating all these debrief points and taking all of that information and absolutely making changes on a regular basis.
Nice, nice stuff. So how did that like debrief concept translate when you started like working back in outside of the military? Did you find it like, was it missing from some of the company that you worked at? Did you introduce it, or what differences did you find?
Yeah, it
Did
definitely
you
was missing. I mean, like, and even to this day, I think that it's oftentimes missing.
I like when you said at the beginning that you learned debriefing during training, and made me reflect that the podcast is specifically about retrospective, but I feel that oftentimes, at least for myself, learned about retrospective about like 5 or 6 years ago, and I've been working for 18
Yeah.
years. So the concept about feedback really didn't come through education or many of the workplaces I've been in Australia or in Europe. So I think that I agree with you on the fact that it's missing. I wish that it was part of the education system. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, I really can only speak to the tech industry. I haven't been. I was in the aviation business for a little while, but, like, obviously the majority of my experience is the tech industry, and it seems like in the tech industry we've had a lot of there's been a lot written and talked and practiced around feedback over the course of the last decade or two, and doing 360 reviews and having written feedback, and Kim Scott wrote Radical Candor a couple years ago, and that's had a big impact, I think, on a lot of folks and a lot of companies. And there have been other books and other things like it. So I feel like there's this desire to have sort of learning cultures and feedback based cultures. The specific concept of retrospectives or after actions or debriefs is still something that, like, I think there's a lot of people that are sort of like, okay, I'm on board with biannual feedback, and I'm on board with being open to feedback and things like that concept. I think a lot of people can be open to. I think there's still a ton of room for companies and for people to adopt more of it, but this concept of a debrief of very like that concept is still something that I think is a little bit more rare. And my first job in the tech industry was at Google, and it most definitely did not exist. I didn't see it happening at all, and I got hired at a really interesting time. I was hired at a time when Sheryl Sandberg had started something called Online Sales and Operations at Google, and it was essentially a team focused on handling large numbers of accounts, as well as operating things like Gmail but also handling large numbers of advertising accounts. And so this team wasn't really a sales team; it was more like just trying to support all the advertisers that were using AdWords. This is in the early to mid 2000s, and when I got hired, the team was probably 600-700 people, and that we wanted to transition it into a sales organization. So we took this whole org and changed everything, changed levels and titles and compensation plans, and created new teams, and really created sales teams. And that took a good year to transition the whole organization. And there was a lot of, then a lot of learning that had to happen, a lot of training, and then a lot of like sales calls and sales meetings, and where like people weren't debriefing. And if they weren't nobody had any clue whether they were doing a good job or not a good job. So um, I definitely tried to. I mean, I introduced it to my teams, but and tried to share it as broadly as possible. Um, I don't think it was, and even to this day, I don't think that this concept of like tactical level debriefs. We go and somebody in your team does a big internal presentation. Do you debrief that? You go on a sales call with people. Do you debrief that, or do you have a project that runs for 3 weeks? Do you debrief how that project went? I still don't think that happens broadly across the industry.
Nice. Yeah. When I decided to start a podcast was some people do like agile on air quotes and do
Mhm.
retrospective on air quotes, but it's oftentimes like it's kind of like an action that is not really like doesn't lead to any learning. So it's more like going through the motions versus actually getting something that is valuable. So I feel maybe sometime is I don't know, the organization is not ready. Sometimes maybe there is something, people are so busy that there is not someone saying, hey, maybe we can do and try this other thing instead of doing whatever we're doing for our retrospectives, and that leads to inaction.
I find that
um,
like as somebody who leads teams, like you can influence the culture, the operating culture, the value, like all sorts of things of that team, right? Like you can definitely, a leader of a team of 10 people or even 50 people can very most definitely say, okay, like here's the concept of debrief, and here or after action or retrospectives, like this is how we do it, and introduce that concept and like hammer away at it and get that team or that organization doing it. um, you can influence and do lots of things when you're leading the team. But I think that like corporate culture is very difficult to influence unless it's adopted and adapted, by the executive team. And in fact, those behaviors are practiced by the executive team. Um, like if the executive team believes in um, strong feedback based culture, then that'll spread throughout the organization. If the executive team doesn't believe in that, it's going to be very, very difficult for it to spread throughout the organization. Almost impossible.
yeah. Yeah, there is a book called Fearless Change by Linda Rising, and she and this other author wrote about how patterns to introduce change into organizations. And but yeah, I see what you're saying, and I feel I've been using some of her patterns and trying to start like some grassroots initiatives in some of our clients. But I agree. I feel that at the very top, it will take like much longer for the change to reach from the bottom to the top versus if the top agrees on some like key concept, like you said about yes, we value feedback, constructive feedback. Yes, we value debriefing, retrospectives, and things like that.
But like you said,
Hmm.
if you've got a team and you're introducing this whatever concept it is, in this case, say debriefing, and if that team adopts it and uses it, and then like you're able to share it with a couple other team leaders and they do it, like it's definitely possible to take that any given concept and eventually get the whole organization on board as it matriculates up. But it's just you're right. It usually takes longer.
So how do we change executives to send them in the army or in the navy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the interesting things, one of the things that I found even at Google was like Google had this really one of the things that attracted me to Google was a emphasis placed on leadership and management, and feedback based culture and leading people um, in a positive and holistic way. And so that really attracted me to Google's culture. What I found though was there was a lot more emphasis placed on managing people well at lower to mid levels than there was at senior or executive levels. Like, it was a little bit more lip service. The people were not held accountable to the same principles at a really senior level as they were at a middle level or at a junior level as managers and leaders. So the point is that like one of the things that was sort of interesting there was I think Google's culture was awesome at a really senior level. I don't think it was so awesome, and it was which is interesting, right? Like you would think that like if the culture wasn't great at a really senior level at a company, how could it be so good below that? And that's a good question.
Yeah, yeah, cool. And I've been listening to this podcast by a guy called Todd Conklin, and this goes back into the retrospective and the debrief. And one thing he repeats often enough is like it's not about uh, the mistake or the thing that happened, but the context of it. And I kind of wanted to link back to the military and like how it's not about maybe like I made this mistake, but the context. Have you found that? And have you found that in the industry that you work on today? That maybe sometimes we focus too much on there's this mistake versus what was the context on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that ultimately debriefs. So the value of a debrief is to learn, right? So um, it it becomes. I mean, one way a debrief and debriefing culture will fail is if the only point of a debrief is to point out who made a mistake and how and why, right? But like that's just the mistakes. And by the way, it's not just mistakes, right? Like I mean, in debriefs, we would cover the good and the bad, right? And so and the way I run debriefs, the way I explain the way that debriefs are run in the military is exactly how I explain it to my teams. It's exactly how I introduce the concept and try to build or build on what's being done in those teams. And so the basic message is, hey, look, when we get done doing something, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about how we did it, what went well and what did not go well. And that's going to be like across the board. I want you to tell me what you think I did well and didn't do well, and vice versa. And it doesn't matter who's the boss and who's the manager and so on and so forth. And so and the whole point is to learn, right? Like we want to get better at what we do. And one way to get better at what we do is to take the time to think about how we do it, how we do things, what we do, and where we can improve. Um, and so I think that like it's really important to keep that level of context in mind when building this kind of process or culture in a team.
Nice. And I like that you said that you were debriefing the debrief. I started running retrospectives on the retrospectives that we run, so that is the
Yeah.
retrospective working. How was the debriefing on the debrief in
It's
the
usually
Navy?
quick. I mean, there were probably a couple things. One, sometimes the person leading the flight isn't definitely not the most senior person, or they might be training. So they might be training to lead a 4-person flight, or a 12-person strike, or something like that. So they might be learning how to lead in that instance. And so there's a more senior instructor in the group who may not be leading the flight, may not be leading the brief or the debrief. And at the end, the person who led the whole thing will debrief the debrief and kind of roll through like, okay, how'd this go? Anything I missed, so on and so forth. And there's a good opportunity for that instructor to jump in and say, okay, here's some things you missed in the debrief, and here's some ways of improving how you debrief.
Nice.
So that's one thing that would happen. Generally, and if it weren't that kind of case where there was an instructor student kind of thing going on, um, the debriefing the debrief could be as simple as like, hey, anything that you guys have for the debrief, anything that I should have done a little bit differently, and again rolling through the folks in the room and sharing feedback. Usually, it
Nice.
was pretty quick.
Nice. Yeah, during retrospectives, we run this activity called our OTI, Return of Time Invested. So we asked for 30 seconds between 0 and 4, how well spent was this time in this meeting? 0,
That's good.
complete waste of time. 4 was awesome. And we asked for one suggestion to make it better. And that's just like a quick way to get some feedback. It doesn't have to be like spending an hour or just like, but we do it I do it at every single retro because it's really important. And sometimes the feedback is not what you want to hear, but I think if you just get used to have it all the time, it just becomes second nature. I think that's part of the training conversation we were having. We have a meeting, then we have a return of time invested. Was it a good use of our time or not? Um,
You do that just with retrospectives or every meeting?
When I have longer meetings where we
Yeah,
do things like scopings, I do that too
yeah,
because sometimes those meetings are like 3 hours. Okay, I want to make sure that the people are in the room. I force them to close their laptops and their phones to put them away. So I want to make sure that is it a good use of your time or not. And if it's not, it's fine. We just need to learn and understand how can we make it better next time.
yep.
Well, this was the half an hour. This is really great. Dan, do you have anything else that you want to share with the audience about debriefings, about your time in the Navy, or like the transition that we didn't cover during my questions?
Well, one of the things that I've spent time thinking about is how do you build really strong teams and how do you build high performing teams, and um, I believe that there are sort of like a few foundational elements to building a really strong high performing team. First is hiring. The second is training, and the last piece is creating a learning organization. That if you have those three components, um, you have, I think, a really good chance of building a high performing team. There's certainly other things that are important, um, but being maniacal about hiring, about training, and about creating a learning culture are the three components that I've seen over the course of my time. Like every high performing team that I've been a part of had those three things in common. And the debriefing concept, I think, folds into this learning culture, of creating an environment that where the culture of that team, that organization, is such that they believe in learning, right? Like everybody wants to learn, everybody wants to develop, and it goes back to that point I said earlier. Like we all learn by doing, but which is great. But if you really want to accelerate your development and accelerate the performance of an organization over time, if you create a learning culture that learns from everything that it does and devotes, the right kind of energy to it, you really sort of can create a much higher performing organization. And I think debriefing's a part of that. I think regular feedback's a part of that. Having the right kinds of surveys and the right kinds of check-ins on how things are going, and how the organization is being led and managed. There's a lot of pieces that I think come into creating a learning organization, a learning culture. But certainly debriefing is, in my experience, the cornerstone element.
Nice. And this is a kind of like a bold question, but if there's an executive listening and they are interested in introducing debriefings in the organization, what's one suggestion or that you would give those executives? What's the next thing to do?
I think one of the most important things to do is to make sure that the debriefing environment is has no rank, right? Like that people don't feel like there's no. You don't want to. You have to create a culture, an environment, a process where people don't feel defensive, where they understand it's all about learning, and it doesn't matter. Making mistakes doesn't matter. Um, the most important thing that what matters is learning from those mistakes and so and I think part of that is that as an executive or as a manager or as a director, you have to be comfortable getting feedback, and you have to make sure um, that people are feel comfortable giving you feedback, right? Um, and so I would focus in on that sort of those cultural norms of like, hey, this is this is a level playing field, and nobody gets punished or in trouble or sort of looked down upon or poorly reviewed because they're making mistakes that are brought out in these debriefs.
Nice.
That cultural element's really important.
I found this interview with Dan really enlightening, and making sure that we have a culture where we can give feedback and being ready to hear feedback, even when maybe it's not what we want to hear, it's critical. Make sure that, I don't know, maybe we have like a quick return of time invested or a quick pluses and delta at the end of your retrospective. Make sure that you get that feedback, because if you don't get feedback on how you're getting feedback on your retrospectives, how do you know if they are working or not? And maybe incorporate that in more meetings. At Pivotal we do a pluses and deltas at the end of pairing day. That's an effective way to give and receive feedback. Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. This is Enrico Teotti. Until next time.